like stop yourself from learning is just be like, oh, there's way too much. It's like, just take it easy. That it's so cool. Every data scientist in the world does not know everything unless you're like unless you're Andrew Ng or like Jan LeCun or like Francois Cholet. Like it is impossible to know absolutely everything in the field, but that should not be a limiting factor as to why you start.
This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is powered by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Nicholas Renotte. Nicholas is a data science specialist at IBM with a bunch of experience in helping clients make the most of their data and leveraging the best in machine learning and deep learning. But he didn't start out there. Oh no, he actually started out as an accountant, built a startup, and somehow along the way found himself loving all things data. When he's not eating pizza or running ultramarathons, he's funneling all that data love into making tutorials that help people get started with data science, machine learning, and deep learning on YouTube. Nick has some of my favorite computer vision tutorials out there on the internet, and his channel is one of the first places I personally go to learn some new tools. I really enjoyed my conversation with him, and I hope you enjoy it as well. Nick, so excited to have you on the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast today. I love your YouTube videos. I think you have some of the most interesting technical tutorials out there. You're also a pretty darn interesting guy and have a great story. So again, thank you for coming on, and I'm excited to be able to share you with the audience.
No, thanks so much for having me, Ken. I've been looking forward to this. I was up late last night. I'm like, oh, I'm so excited to speak to Ken and talk data. As you know, it's something I'm super passionate about. So thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So you're obviously from Australia. You're the second Aussie that I've had on here. We've had Daniel Burke, and very, very different appearance. So Daniel, when he came on, had the largest mullet, or the best mullet of quote unquote data people. I think you're working pretty hard on the best buzz cut. So I love the diversity of guests.
I should have done a mohawk for you, Ken. I've been toying with the idea for the last couple of weeks.
Hey, why not? I love it. So to jump in to help people get familiar with you, I always love to understand how you first got interested in data. Was this a pivotal moment? Was it one thing that happened to you that were like, wow, this is a crazy awesome field? Or was it more of a slow progression where you realized, hey, this is a great place to work. I want to do more of this and sort of pull on that thread?
Yeah, great question. So I think in order to dive into that, we need to go way back. And like, I'm talking really far back to when I was around about 11 or 12. So a big thing which influenced my introduction to data was Excel. So I think that particular tool is something that a lot of people start to experiment with, particularly when they get data. Somebody sends you a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet, you open it up, you're like, hey, this is a whole bunch information. What do I do with it? So when I was really, really young, my father actually traded stocks, and I was super interested in this big thing called the financial markets. I was like, hey, how can I help dad out and learn a little bit while I'm at it? So I started downloading transaction histories, and I started looking at different stock pieces of information. And I remember there used to be this feature in Excel, which was almost like a web crawler. So you could select some data, it would go out to a table and it would automatically refresh. And I was like, this is so cool. I'm like, I've got like a spreadsheet, it's pulling data dynamically, and I'm able to like make metrics on the fly. I just thought it like blew my mind that tech was out there and you could do stuff with it. Anyway, that sort of stemmed. So dad sort of saw that I was playing around with these Excel spreadsheets, and he's like, all right, he's clearly got an interest in this. And at the time, Excel was really, really big in his workplace. And he said, hey, Nick, a really, really smart thing for you to do would be to learn how to make macros. Because what he saw in his workplace was that the people that could automate certain things and could produce repeatable sets of processes were really, really well valued. Now, that's it's really funny because fast forward to, I don't know what it would be, 10 or 11 years later, when I went for my first graduate job, they actually hired me, even though I had like this big finance and accounting degree and whatnot. the thing that stuck out most to them was the fact that, hey, this guy can write code and build macros to be able to automate our finance and our accounting based stuff. So I was like, Dad, you like literally landed me my graduate job, which is nuts. But yeah, so like I've always been super interested. Like, so from that time, I would extract stock data, and then we moved on to options. And then I was like, hey, web scraping is cool. So I still played around with that, all in Excel. I never really touched Python until, to be honest, probably like 3 or 4 years ago is when I first started with Python. And then from there, it's been a never-ending journey. So from that grad job, I actually did quite a fair bit of data processing. I was in a financial role, so that basically meant that I was doing a lot of like number crunching for accounting, risk. One of the really, really cool roles that I actually had in that place, well, actually, I haven't said where that place is. So the first graduate role that I had was at the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is like a central bank. And so we did a bunch of graduate rotations. Now, I started out in like the management accounting area because my degree was based on accounting and finance. And then I rotated around into like projects. So again, I did more number crunching there. But the coolest rotation, like listen to this, the coolest rotation that I got was I actually got to go into the division that prints the banknotes. Yeah, so I got to do a bunch of like banknote pricing, and like it's so cool like what happens behind the scenes. It's like how do you actually price a banknote? Like what is the cost of production to print a banknote? And you're probably thinking, hey, it's like a piece of paper or a piece of plastic, but there is like so much innovation that goes into like printing one of those banknotes because forgery and criminal activity is so prevalent in terms of counterfeiting banknotes. So so much stuff that happens there. But all right, so we're at the RBA, so we've gone and produced a bunch of stuff. From there, I actually decided that I really wanted to get more into, I guess, what you'd call now like advanced analytics. And so I actually started with BI. So I started experimenting with different BI tools. I noticed that some of them had like predictive capabilities. I was like, yeah, this seems all right. And literally off the cuff, one of my coworkers would be like, or actually said to me, and he said, "Hey Nick, I'm learning data science," and like me being a complete idiot, he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm learning supervised learning," and I'm like, "Whoa, I guess that's kind of a lot safer than unsupervised learning. You don't just want to let it go and do whatever it wants to do." I had no idea what I was talking about at the time, so I'm like, "Oh yeah, cool, all right, seems interesting." Anyway, that just flew off. I didn't pay any attention to that. We actually had a team come in and start building this system for us that would automate our financial modeling. And that was really when I started to get into programming for data, right? And so we were building data pipelines and we were bringing stuff. I got exposed to SQL. So a whole bunch of stuff happened there. And I actually went and joined a boutique consultancy off the back of that did that type of financial modeling. And I've always got this thing whenever I go into a job that I'm like, all right, what can I do that is going to make me a little bit different to everyone else that's here? So imagine the core thing that particular company does is like this financial modeling. I'm like, all right, what can I do a little bit differently? And that's when I went and learned Python. So I enrolled in my master's. I started learning Python. I literally sat down at the university for like 5 weekends in a row and literally just went through the Python crash course book, literally page after page. I'd write a bunch of stuff in a notebook. I'd go to the next page. And that was how I learned. And that was kind of alongside the master's, but the master's was in R. So yeah, there was that. But I've probably gone and done a little bit of a deep dive. But yeah, that's how I got started in data.
I love that. To me, starting in Excel is something that almost everyone does, especially if you're maybe a little bit older. Perhaps not as many students coming straight out of college are doing it that way. But that's how I got my start. I started trying to build models. I was looking at my golf performance in Excel. I was looking at other data in Excel. And you eventually reach a point where you're limited by your tools and you start to expand beyond that. And there are some negative stigmas around Excel. There's still, in the data science space, you'll kind of get scoffed at. But at the same time, from a learning perspective, it seems like a really perfect transition tool to get to the next step, to get to the next level, to pick up the fundamental skills. And I personally am
I would like to think that I'm tool agnostic, right? If Excel is the right tool for what I'm doing, if it's the easiest thing, if I just have to make a really simple chart sometimes, or if I just want to look at the data, why not open it in Excel? It's still an incredibly powerful tool. You might be a little tied to a Microsoft ecosystem if you do that, but uh, I really like how you were able to take that and you leveraged it into quite a few opportunities. And then you were able to find out that there was more beyond that, and you picked it up seemingly pretty quickly.
I think it's crazy, right? So data science, when I was doing my degree, was not a field. I think it sort of just happened by chance. I was like, wait, so you can take data and a output or label and train a model to understand the relationship, and like my mind was just blown, and I'm like, what? I'm like, why has nobody told me this is a thing? And as soon as I like clicked that that was a field, I'm like, because I was obviously a huge finance guy, I'm like, I could build a trading robot. I could go and like find top selling products in Shopify stores and build this, my entrepreneur coming out and build like Shopify stores. I'm like, I just like my mind is absolutely insane. So like, and I guess to this day, I'm still, every time I build a model, I'm still fascinated. I'm like, we just built a model that does what? And it's crazy. I think it's like having a superpower, right?
I it's funny, I had the exact same experience where once I realized what was possible, my mind started going to all the really cool problems that I could solve or the things that I could explore. And that's what makes data science fun for me, honestly, is that I feel like I have the capability or I have the tools or the understanding to solve or to attempt to solve or to point towards answers at any of the questions that I have about the future or any of the questions that I have within a specific domain. And I really don't like I don't I enjoy coding sometimes. I don't love coding. I like the tools are okay and interesting, the math is okay and interesting, but I don't like inherently love that process. I don't like diving into that. What I love, what I am immensely passionate about is finding solutions and telling stories. And to me, that is an incredible motivating factor and it's an incredible reason to dive into this field is that like it's kind of crazy powerful if you think about it to be able to develop this skill set. And it's also a little overwhelming because there is so much within this domain to continue to learn.
That is a thing that I continuously struggle with. There is literally so much, and I think it is so hard to be across everything. And I think I made my peace with the fact that I'm never going to know everything. And I'd rather just be, I think you actually might have said it in a previous conversation we had. It's great to be a curious beginner. I think that might have been the term that you used, but there's just way too much. And it's, I think the worst thing that somebody new to this space can do is to try to learn absolutely everything because you'll get so disheartened. But like the field is so cool. Like that the last thing that you should like stop yourself from learning is just be like, oh, there's way too much. It's like just take it easy. That it's so cool. Every data scientist in the world does not know everything unless you're like unless you're Andrew Ng or like Jan LeCun or like Francois Cholet. Like it is impossible to know absolutely everything in the field, but that should not be a limiting factor as to why you start, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think there's a difference between knowing everything in the field and realizing that you probably could know everything in the field. Like the idea of meta learning to me is unbelievably powerful, right? It's that I know how to pick up a new skill, I know how to understand documentation, I know how to do enough math to be able to understand what's going on under the hood of most of these algorithms. And that means for the most part, any of the tools out there, a lot of the algorithms out there, I can understand and I can implement if I put in the time. But the opportunity cost of that time is relative to the project that I'm doing. So, there are very few projects out there where I'm like, oh, that's not possible for me. I actually don't think there are any out there that I'm like, oh, I couldn't do that. It's just how much time would I have to invest learning that skill set? What's the overhead? What's the value? Those types of things. And that's an incredibly freeing thing for me is knowing that, hey, I could do this if I have the time and it's worth the effort. But a lot of the times it's not because I haven't specialized in that area, or it's just not that interesting to me. But the fact that from my past experiences, I know that I could tackle those challenges, that's a very different thing than not knowing it at all. It's just that I've made that choice to not know it because I have better things to work on, or I don't have the time, or whatever it might be. And the sooner people get to that realization, I firmly believe that within this domain, like like if you really dive into something, you'll probably understand it. But you should be thinking about, should you dive into it based on your own personal constraints?
Yeah, completely agree. It's all learnable, right? There's resources out the kazoo. Like there is just so much content out there. Like you can definitely learn it. It's more just, I think you're right. It's, do you want to invest the time in learning a particular thing? Because there is so much. Like, is this thing going to be interesting enough for you to want to go and use it or leverage it somewhere?
Incredible. And so refresh my memory. In college, you studied finance and accounting. Is that correct?
Sure did. Yep.
So accounting go ahead.
I'm actually a chartered accountant. Like this is what like everyone like, they're like, how are you a data scientist and a chartered accountant? Aren't they just all like balance sheets and P&L statements and cash flow statements? And yeah, so I majored in accounting and finance. And I think probably like the one saving factor in what allowed me to leverage some of that for what I do now is that the finance part of my degree was hyper math heavy. Like I was really, really into like hardcore finance. So like we're talking like derivative pricing, Monte Carlo simulation. So that was probably like my one saving grace in terms of allowing me to see that the more technical side of math. Like I wanted to go into sales and trading inside of a big trading house or a investment bank. Thankfully that didn't work out, but that's where I wanted to go. So I was just, it's like, hey, more math, throw it at me, I'll work it out. And like I'll never forget like trying to remember like the Black-Scholes formula, and it was like it's been seared into my mind how difficult and ridiculous that was. So
well, if you use Monte Carlo simulation, you get the same results, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? Random walk.
Yeah. But to me, I've always seen accounting and data science as almost diametrically opposed forces, where accounting is very structured, purely rule-based on systems that we've created, whereas data science is more free-form, where you're working with what you have and you're creating your own architecture for the most part. How are you able to reconcile those things? And maybe was it the fact that accounting by definition is more that way and you don't think that way that pushed you into a data career path?
I think it was definitely the latter. So as you probably might have guessed, being a creative accountant is not necessarily a good thing. And being a data scientist, creativity is obviously very favored because it allows you're open to new ideas. So I was never a good accountant. Like if you asked me to write a journal, I'd probably screw it up 9 times out of 10. But what I was able to do was find the story in the data. And so looking through data and trying to work out what might have happened from a business perspective and analyzing that data was something that I'd actually done throughout my degree. So as part of my degree, or during my degree, I was actually a cadet. I think they call it a cadet. It might be called an intern now at Ernst and search through data to find insight. So it was less about the accounting and more about telling the story, which I think is where that skill is readily transferable over to data science, because more often than not, you're trying to find a trend or a pattern or trying to find the golden nugget in the inside of the mountain, right? So I think that's where it translated over. But yeah, I don't think I was ever cut out to try to be a CFO or to go up that path. And a big thing about the roles that I take or the work that I do is that if I look upward within an organization and I'm not interested in the highest role possible or interested in the work that the person at the top does, then I'm like, I don't know if this is the job for me, because what's the point of being at the top of the wrong ladder if it's not the right ladder? You'd rather be at the bottom of the right ladder rather than at the top of the wrong ladder. And that's something that's always sort of stuck with me. So I was very, welcome to risk. So I was always happy to move around and change jobs and find something that I really enjoyed. So accounting really didn't stay on my plate for too long.
Well, it's funny. A lot of those things you talked about related to corporate ladder, to risk, and you also talked about your entrepreneurial sort of spirit and your experience with that. How did you reconcile all of those things? I think that, for example, entrepreneurship sort of runs contra to ladder climbing, and it also is almost the opposite in terms of risk assessment with accounting and finance. So I'd love to hear your sort of entrepreneurial journey and your experiences there, and your understanding of that.
That's a great question. So I think the way that I've approached it is that most of the startups and startup ideas that I've had are startup ideas which would be readily applicable to large corporate entities. So I think having that corporate experience has really helped me to go, hey, they've got this problem. It'd be really smart if they approached it this way, or if they did this. And I was always the guy that question everything. So if we did a process, like I'll never forget, I went into that job and my boss, like, absolutely love him. He supported me to go do what I wanted, but he said, hey Nick, we do this journal because there's this thing screwed up in this system, so we need to back X out of this, and we need to make a 10% adjustment because it also adds on like this GST implication. I was like, wait, what? Can't we just go fix the system? Like, why are we putting in this journal every month and like I'm having to spend 7 hours trying to do these ridiculous calculations? Just go fix the system, man. And so like it's always been in my mind that I'm like, hey, like I think the corporate life, that there are so many inefficiencies, that there are so many opportunities to improve aspects of those organizations. And one of the a thing that frustrates me to absolute tears is the healthcare system. Like it is just one of the, it's almost like a uncharted territory when it comes to startups. There is still so much opportunity in that space, because if you look at the processes and how things run, there are a ton of things which I think could be done better. That being said, it's a tough nut to crack. But I think having corporate experience definitely allows you to see what could potentially be done better, and it does give you those sort of startup ideas. So yeah, I don't think it's conducive to building startups, but it definitely allows you to see opportunities.
Awesome. I really like that. I think that I personally, I like business to business, but business to consumer is something that I see as more of to lower hanging fruit, because having worked in a couple big companies, you see bureaucracy, you see what it takes to get something sold or to partner with some of these organizations, and it is like, wow, that's a lot of overhead, a lot of sales, a lot of these things that honestly just aren't quite as fun for me. Something that I would love to explore is your specific entrepreneurial endeavors, and I think we've both probably had a couple failed ones on that front, and just sort of understanding what went wrong, but also what you learned from those experiences, and how that translates to either what you do now, how that translates to your content, how that translates to anything.
Yeah, definitely. What went wrong is probably the understatement of the history. Mine completely blew up in my face, but it's definitely something that's allowed me to learn a ton. So the startup that let's actually start where it actually was generated from. So when I started at that boutique consultancy firm, at the same time I actually started my master's degree. So it was a master's in data science, and the university had their own mini startup accelerator attached to it. So I think it was called UTS Startups. And so I thought, hey, this would be a great opportunity. And I was actually going to start my YouTube channel then. So I actually put it on hold for 2 years while I built this startup. So I actually went into that accelerator and said, hey, I'm going to give this thing a crack, see what comes out of it. And at the time, one of my family members had actually gone through hospital, and she had actually had the worst experience I had ever seen. It was there was the transfer of information between the hospital and the patient was something which was like, I think that it is so one-sided. Like, there is so much information, so much data that's available to be transferred just to give the patient a little bit more clarity and an idea as to what their treatment process was going to be like. I thought that there was a huge opportunity to improve that transfer of information. So I went into this startup, and I'll never forget that there was this pitch night, and basically anyone could stand up in front of all the other potential entrepreneurs and go and pitch their ideas. I stood up and like I pitched this really heartfelt story. So I started with what had happened, why I think there's an opportunity here, how would we go about changing it. And so I went through this startup accelerator. So many times I got shot down by people. They're like, don't even bother approaching hospitals. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. They don't really want this. It's going to be tough. And I'm like, they need this. Like, it's not that they don't want it. They need, you know what? Now that COVID's happening, it probably would have been the best time to start this startup, because it probably would have allowed people to process through. Like, I've seen a ton of innovation happen in hospitals as a result. But anyhow, I digress. So went through this startup accelerator, and the whole idea that we generated was this application that you could have on your phone. And I think I was sort of enthralled by the allure of new technologies. We're actually going to use a phone which would actually scan a patient's barcode using OCR. It would pick up the patient, and it would actually tell them what their journey was going to be from start to finish through the hospital. So it would say, okay, so you're going to enter X, Y, and Z hospital for this particular symptom, or you're going to be treated. So the doctor's going to see you at 11 a.m. Then you're going to get lunch. Then you might need to have this x-ray. And then from that, there's 3 possible options. And then from there, you will, the doctor or the nurse will come and give you your medication. You'll then be released. There was a lot of promise in this, right? So there's a couple of key metrics that hospitals look at in terms of evaluating their performance. That is readmissions. So when a patient has come into hospital, they've been treated, they leave, and then they have to come back because their symptoms either reoccur or something goes wrong. So readmissions was a big one. And then the number of days that a patient spends in a bed. So it's almost taking the humanity out of it a little bit. But that obviously they've got a fixed number of beds that they can use to service their population. So they basically need to churn through. And we're like, hey, if we improve this experience, improved experience actually has a linkage to better performance for the hospital. Anyway, we pitched the idea, we went through, we were building it alongside the hospital. And I'll never forget, it was a 2-hour drive from my place to the hospital. So every time we wanted to go there, it's a 2-hour drive. My car sucked. I'll never forget, there was this one giant hill on the way to the hospital, and the car literally always struggled trying to get up. So like whenever like my founders and I were in the car, we're like, this is going to be interesting this time. Like one time it was raining. It was like, is this startup really worth it, trying to get the car up the hill? Anyway, but so we went through and we built up this prototype app. And a big thing that I've always been taught whenever you're building companies or products is it's not validated until the person puts the money where their mouth is. So until they buy the product, it means nothing, or at least that's the way that I operate now. Until somebody might say, hey, this is great, I'd love it, I'd love to try it out. Until somebody's bought it, very big on trying to close early on. So we built the prototype app, and I was talking to certain people at the hospital, and I'd say, hey, all right, so we've built this. Are you happy to proceed? Like, would you like to have a small scale implementation or go down a paid proof of concept to have this inside of the hospital? And they're like, yeah, we've got budget aside, we've got X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, okay, so all right, let's send out an invoice. So like I went into, I don't know, startuphelpers.com and tried to find an invoice and produce something. And I sent it to them. I'm like, hey guys, this is going to be the price for the POC. So I priced it really intelligently. It was just like, they were our first customer. So I'm like, hey, this is going to be the price. And then we'll have like a support fee for any enhancements or any additional stuff that you want to have built up on the top of this. So a key thing is like enterprise-based software is priced completely differently to what you would produce for B2C. So normally having this sort of enterprise license plus a support cost is or like support fee is pretty standard. At least I think so. If anybody on the podcast thinks differently, definitely let me know, because I'd love to hear. Anyway, so we produced this invoice, we sent it to them, and they're like, "Hey Nick, can you drive up to the hospital? We'd love to have a chat." And in my mind, I'm like, "Yes, they're gonna sign this invoice. They're gonna hand it over. It's all gonna be great. We're gonna land our first paid customer. Like, it's a huge milestone." And so again, drive 2 hours to the hospital. Like, I put my suit on because, again, corporate attire and whatnot. I'm like, all right, let's go. We're gonna nail this. It's gonna be so good. And at the time, my co-founders couldn't attend. Like, they both had side jobs, and it was in the middle of the day. And so I'd taken the day off to go to this meeting. Drive the 2 hours, get in there. The head of the hospital comes in and he said, "Hey Nick, we can't pay for this, and we're not going to pay for it, and we don't have budget." And I'm just sitting there. I'm like, man, we spent 2 years building this. Every indication said that you wanted it, that you had budget for it, you wanted to buy it. I'm like, what do you mean you don't want it? And they're like, "Oh, we were just like, we're trying to produce innovation inside the hospital. We thought this is a great idea." I'm like, ah, man, like there were so many things, or so many red flags I probably could have picked up along the way to not invest 2 years in this. But that being said, looking back on it now, I learned an absolute ton. It was a complete failure. After that, I sort of had to decide, do we want to go and approach other hospitals? And I kind of realized at that point that, like, my heart really just wasn't in it. Like, if ever you want to go and do something, anyone on the listening to this podcast, if ever you want to go and do something really, really hard, you really got to want it. You really got to like it. Like, producing YouTube content, or building a startup, or doing anything which is going to be difficult, that the best thing that you can have in your corner is that you enjoy it, because that is going to help you get through when times are tough. And I made the decision at that point that my heart just wasn't in it anymore. And so we shut it all down. There was a whole bunch of cool tech, so I still learned a ton of stuff, but ultimately it was a failure to validate that the customer, that we were actually sort of addressing a bleeding neck problem. That's sort of how I've always thought about it. If they've got a bleeding neck, they're probably going to want to try to stem that staunch of blood. So rather than just having a paper cut, right, they're two different problems that you're trying to approach. But yeah, that's my startup failure in a nutshell.
That's a great story, honestly. That's something that I really didn't like about the nature of most startup businesses, is you work really hard and then there's a singular payoff, right? There's like you have to win a client, you have to do this to get to that next level. And that overhead around that is binary, right?
Mm-hmm.
You either succeed or fail in each individual client interaction that you have. And to me, that was unbelievably stressful. I found that from creating content, or YouTube, or those types of businesses, it was almost the opposite, right? Is that I can generate, and I see iterative and incremental improvement and change over time. And that resonated so much more with me, is that, hey, if I continue to do that, I see the progress, right? Like, in theory, what you just described, although you built all these things, from a pure business perspective, there was literally no progress. From like a VC perspective or whatever it is, because there was no income, there was no growth, there was none of these things on the customer side. And that to me was very disheartening when I was trying to pursue these businesses. I quit my job in Chicago to pursue a small startup where I was building dashboards for hotel lobbies and business centers and schools. And I had to go in and sell dashboards to all these different places. And there's overhead around what TVs they were using. There's overhead around those things. And that's just like a pain in the butt, right? Like, it's, okay, I have to do all the building, I have to do all the selling. And even if I build a great product, someone might not use it or might not see it. In my mind, there's a very different way of doing business now, and there's a very different way of growing. And those can be successful, but in my mind, you really have to have like funding and connections to drive those types of things. And there's a high likelihood I try another like business to business endeavor like that down the road. But for a first company, I realized, like, wow, that is backwards. That is not how I want to do these things. And I think I've articulated this before. Like, I love creating content. I love videos. I love the podcast. But a huge positive benefit of that, like a somewhat intended, somewhat unintended, not consequence, but benefit, is that through this I've created large communities, right? And now anything that I build, anything that I want to put out in the world, I have people who would at least test it, would at least give me feedback, would at least experiment it. And if it's a good product and it creates value for them, they could also be customers of a product that I create. It's not like I'm trying to sell the people that watch my video stuff. It's that I'm trying to build things that make their lives valuable because they're a like somewhat cohesive group of people, and they might have similar problems to each other. And when you flip the equation upside down like that, where it's like, okay, rather than find a market and try and meet its needs and hope that you hit it, why wouldn't you try to build a group of people that have a similar problem, or like bring them together around a similar problem and help them solve that problem with some sort of product or solution. And I think at scale also, like, that creates a tremendous value for them. Like, I create a ton of free content, I also have some paid content, and that to me is that realization that entrepreneurship doesn't have to be like, hey, I build something and I try it and sell it to someone. It was an unbelievable feeling. Did you sort of get that feeling with your content creation on YouTube as well?
100%. And I think I was listening to a podcast by Sam Parr and Sean Puri. So like My First Million, like I'm cute, like I love startups. So I'm always trying to think up new ideas. But they basically said that shitty product plus good distribution beats good product plus shitty distribution every single time. And I was like, why didn't I think of that? So like, if you already have a pipeline to get your product out there or to get your service out there, that it is reliable, that you can lean on, that you can leverage, that you can learn from, that is going to make you about 1 billion times more successful than if you just have a really good product and your distribution strategy is sort of hope to try to get it out there. So, and I think building up one of those distribution pipelines is a lot easier when you are going business to consumer, or you're able to go direct to an individual, because having a pipeline to companies is really tough. And then you're in the market competing with the Microsofts, the Googles, the Amazons of the world. So it is so much more satisfying to solve somebody that is like me, solve somebody's problem that sort of resonates with me, than it is trying to go out there and try to solve a business's problem, because it's just 1 billion times harder, and the risk to reward ratio is dramatically skewed not in your favor. So yeah, lesson learned there.
Something I want to add to that is that, having not that good a product but a good distribution pipeline, obviously we want to provide good products to everyone.
Correct. Yeah.
But on the flip side of that, if you already have the distribution pipeline, I think it's significantly easier for you to make a good product because of data. You have information on that pipeline. You have information on the people that you could be creating value for. When we're building a product for, even if it's for a specific company like a hospital, right? There's a lot of information that you don't have. There's a lot of things that you can't ask. There's a lot of stuff, at least in the US, that you can't understand about individual patient data. And on the flip side, when you're building something for individuals, you can ask them all the time. You can test stuff. You can put stuff out there, and they will give you feedback, especially if it feels like, if they're influencing the product and making it better for themselves. That to me is just such an incredibly powerful mechanism. Getting to the, I guess that higher concept about YouTube and your journey there, obviously, I don't think anyone who has success on YouTube, unless you're like one of the crazy like YouTuber type people, I don't think anyone really gets into this space for like money or for career development. Like, it has to be a pursuit of passion, or because you enjoy it, or because you want to help people, because it's just too much work otherwise. I'd love to hear about your experience starting this. You said you were planning to, and you wanted to get into it, and you held it off for a while. But what is your story around YouTube and content creation? Why did it resonate with you? And how did you go about this process of becoming a YouTuber?
This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is brought to you by Z by HP. HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Z is specifically made for high performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z4 workstation. I really love that the Z line can come standard with Linux, and they also can be configured with the data science software stack. With the software stack, you can get right into the work of doing data science on day one without the overhead of having to completely reconfigure your new machine. Now back to our show.
Yeah, so I think the main reason that I do YouTube now is I just love tech, right? Like I love deep learning, I love machine learning, and I'm like, I just want to share this with the world. I think it's so cool. In terms of how I got started with content creation, it probably started around about when I got my first graduate job. So I was really big into learning how to produce content, and it started off with my blog. So actually, again, I was still in a finance space at that stage. So I actually started a blog called I Can Budget, and it was about personal finance. And it really like sort of pushed me to go, hey, how can I be consistent? How can I produce content which is of a standard of quality that I'm happy with? And so I started learning about like a big thing that I'm sure you know for YouTube is consistency. So you want to consistently produce high quality content as often as you can. And consistency can be a double-edged sword, because sometimes you can try to be too consistent and try to push out too much, and it just all falls apart because it is very mentally taxing. But yeah, so it all started out in my graduate job. I was building up this blog called I Can Budget, and eventually I was like, man, I don't even care about finance anymore. So that I literally just threw that all away. I'm like, this is boring. There's so much more stuff in the world, Nick. Go find something more interesting to do. So that happened. I started getting into this data space and BI, and actually started up a second blog, which was nicholasrenotte.com. And I would just post about really cool things that are happening in the data science space. And I would try to show off new technologies. Funnily enough, that blog is what eventually landed me the role that I'm currently in. So that blog and then starting YouTube got me this role. So I would start to write, I'd start to write technical blogs. I would start producing video-based content. And I actually sent it to who is now my team leader. I was like, hey, I think this is really cool. You guys should be showing this in the space. There's so much opportunity here. And eventually I got an interview from that, and now I just do it for them as part of my work, and like I use it to show clients all the time. But it's progressed. So like originally it was just to produce content for the sake of producing content, but now it's got like all these sorts of benefits, because I can send it to a client and be like, hey, have you tried this in your business? Or hey, have you looked at this strategy? And I'll never forget that I was on a call, it was late at night with one of my clients, and they're like, hey, Nick, we've got all this data and we need to process it. And we're going to try to use like a convolutional neural network to scan the data because if it's of a certain shape. And I was like, hey, I actually know what the hell this guy's talking about. Like I would have never had a clue if I hadn't had started YouTube. So I was like, oh, okay, so it's got other benefits. But yeah, so basically I was always trying to produce content from I guess an earlier stage in my career. It hadn't transitioned over to YouTube until way later. But yeah, so now what I try to do is just share a lot of technical content, like how to build practical machine learning and deep learning models for stuff that you're going to use in the real world. And I think I've probably gotten a little bit away from where I wanted to be in the last couple of weeks, but I've been trying cool tech. But I'm very much trying to go back to, hey, this is how you build practical stuff, how you implement it in an app, how you might put it on a website. So yeah, that's where YouTube is at the moment. But basically, it's served as a really good platform to help keep my skill development consistent, but as well as sharing some knowledge with the world, which is always want to share.
I love that. And something that I've also experienced is that you do these things, just as you said, to keep sharp a little bit as well. And is there possibly a better way to keep your skills up to a high level than like doing work and sharing it? I personally don't think so. Right. I mean, I've used YouTube to hold me accountable on quite a lot of things, I might be slipping a little bit these days because my work is piling up pretty aggressively. But to me, the idea that I'm going to be doing these work, I'm going to be teaching it, that adds another level of rigor to how I'm approaching it. If I know that I have to convey that information to other people, I think about it a little bit differently. And that helps me to fundamentally understand it better. I've mentioned this a lot, but one of the reasons I got into YouTube to begin with is because I wanted to improve my ability to speak publicly. I wanted to improve the way that I structured conversation. Same thing why I started the podcast. But that was a selfish personal endeavor to improve, but it also creates value for other people. Like, we're having an awesome conversation here that I'm sure people are going to learn a lot from. And that's all while still improving my, my personal development goals and being able to network and do all these other positive things for me myself. And I love those win-win trade-offs where you're able to grow, you're able to provide valuable information, you're even able to make some side income, those types of things. I just love that there's so many opportunities for those positive feedback loops within the space.
Yeah, I think there's a different level of risk when you're trying to teach someone something. So like I've got this big thing in my psyche that if I don't completely understand something or understand it to a certain level and I have to go present on it, I'm like shit scared. I'm like, I don't really understand this thing and I'm going to have to go teach somebody about it. And like, I feel like an imposter. And I think that imposter syndrome is, I don't know if it's just unique to me, but that adds a certain level of risk and it scares the crap out of me. So in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, I have to go and learn this to a significantly more sophisticated level so that I can ideally communicate my ideas in a succinct, efficient, and clear manner. So you're right. I think it definitely adds a different level, or I personally think it adds a different level of risk, which makes me go and learn better to ideally convey those ideas.
Yeah, I think that, at least for me, I've had a very similar experience with imposter syndrome, and it's that it's scary. There's two factors that really help. Is that one, it pushes me to do better work and double check it and reinforce it and have other people in the community that I send my stuff and make sure it's valid. And the other thing is that if you produce a lot of volume, it becomes less and less scary to put stuff out there because you have this whole body of work. And if you make a little mistake, people will probably or hopefully be a little bit more lenient with you, because everyone does make mistakes, right? Especially if you're creating these large volumes of content. There are some mistakes that are not okay to make, but for the most part, if you're producing a lot, any of the little things that you might struggle with get kind of lost in the flow of things. And as someone who's a little bit of a perfectionist, that's allowed me to create significantly more, because I realized that, hey, the aggregate of my work, like 99.9%, I think is really high level. And there's, a fraction of a percent that I think could really be improved. But as I create more work, and if it's pretty good on aggregate, that percentage I'm okay with, rather than every single piece has to be perfect. That I don't think would lead to me producing, almost probably 200 videos now.
And I think it's okay for people to know as well, right? Like there are going to be times when certain videos that you produce, I don't know if you have the same feeling, but certain videos you produce, you're like, wow, that was an awesome video. And then others, you're like, I could have made this a billion times better. I want to re-record the entire thing. I'm going to just start from scratch. Like right now, I'm in the middle of recording like a 6-hour tutorial and everything in me is like screaming, just restart it, Nick. It wasn't that good. And then I'm thinking, God, do you want to teach the people this stuff or do you want to go and perfect this tutorial for your own sake? So do you have that same feeling again?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is that in terms of enjoyment from people, like the amount that they get out of it between something I think is an incredible video versus like a meh video is virtually the same. Some of the videos that I put out there, I was like, that was okay. It wasn't a great video. They've done the best for my channel and viewership and those types of things.
Yeah.
And, I never want to put out something that I'm not okay with being out there. But some of the times, especially with tutorial content, my thought is that, like, are they really going to notice? Are people really going to notice if like the font is slightly too big, or there are these like little adjustments that are off? Probably not. And am I okay with having some of those things out there in a 2 hour long video, or like an hour long video, or whatever it might be? I'm probably okay with that if it means for my sanity that it's part of one of those things. So my thought is like, what truly detracts from the learning experience? And if there's small things that don't detract from it, like maybe you don't like the look on your face or something like that, I usually let those slide, especially in longer form stuff. I mean, I don't, for the most part, if we want to edit the podcast episodes, we do. Like if the guest wants something cut out or whatever it is. But for me, if I'm fumbling or mumbling or whatever it is a little bit, I leave it. I mean, that's how a normal conversation flows. I don't think anything we're talking about is boring or awkward or anything like that. And even if it is, like, most people who are in a podcast for 30, 40 minutes already, they're not going to be like, oh, there's a little lull in conversation, I'm just going to turn it off. Like, you're into it already, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit how I view the longer form content, is like, people like the realism. People like seeing what it's really like. People are in it to learn, not for entertainment, and sometimes entertainment. But it's all about the purpose and matching the type of content and the edits and whatever it is to why someone is there. And I at least that's helped me justify things. People in the comments feel free to disagree with me. They get your tutorials suck, like whatever it might be.
Fix them, dude.
Remake
But you know
every
what?
video.
Yeah, you know what I was just thinking though. Like, so when I first started coding, one of the things that I used to love seeing happen was I'd love to see the code break, and then the person writing the tutorial, their process for fixing that error. It's like, all right, this is like completely broken. How do we go and fix this thing? And I try to make sure that I have almost zero errors in my tutorials. And admittedly, it never happens. Like, always something breaks. But I'm just thinking about it now. I kind of used to like that because it adds a level of realism, and you see what it's like to actually do it for real. That stuff is going to break, dependencies won't match, or there'll be inconsistencies, or maybe you'll train a model, you go and test it out in the real world, and your results will absolutely suck. I guess I just had this realization now on this podcast. But yeah, I think there's there you go, Ken. You enlightened me. But okay, yeah,
Well,
I don't know. That's just my realization.
That's the best feedback I've gotten from my data science project from scratch series, is I left in all the places where I struggled. I left in all of the places where I had to debug or fix it or whatever it might be. And overwhelmingly, people have enjoyed that. They say, a lot of it is a little too clean and contained. And when you show the errors you have, it makes it human. It makes it not like, I'm like a coding robot. I still clip some things because I want to make it not overwhelmingly long and boring. But the conflict and resolution, if we really think about it, at least for me in my data science work, that's like 60% of the time, right? I'm probably spending about 40% of the time like planning and like structuring code and actually coding. And then 60% of the time I'm debugging and fixing things and adjusting that. And I personally think a good ratio, at least in the tutorials that I create, is around like 80-20, where I'm coding and debugging 20% of the time. I mean, again, that's not necessarily realistic of work, but it's a good balance to find between what what I'm trying to do and what the real work is actually like. On the other hand, I just like don't make as many tutorials. You're absolutely a tutorial expert in comparison. But it is it might save you some time too if you go about it that way, because you won't have to worry about the
Yeah, now that I'm thinking about it. So like this tutorial, I'm building a like a Siamese neural network, which allows you to do facial verification, right? So like, how you got Face ID on your phone and it goes and sort of scans your face and unlocks your phone. So I'm effectively building a neural network that does that. And so yesterday I started the tutorial, I recorded an hour, and I was just exhausted by the end. I'm like, oh, this is like so perfect. Like I don't want to say it's so perfect, but I'm like, I tried to make it as as error free as possible. And it was just exhausting. Like I like slanging code and just like clanging and banging and getting stuff together and working. So that the way I develop is completely different to the way I teach tutorials. But now you got me thinking maybe I should just go freeform and build stuff off the wall and see what happens.
Well, you know, we are data scientists. I think it wouldn't hurt. Tag me in a community post and make a poll and see what people would prefer. That would be really fun. We can sort of co-author some research on that front.
Let me make a note on that. So I'm definitely gonna do that. I'm super interested. Like, because if I just did like one big off the wall tutorial, it'd be super interesting to see what the performance of that is like versus like something which is really refined and structured. It'll probably still be refined and structured. I've got massive OCD, but it'll be interesting to see.
Well, we could. I'd be potentially open to collaborating on something later in the year, early next year, if you wanted to do like a more raw form tutorial where we both worked on something. That could be kind of fun.
Hell yeah, sounds good.
So one thing that we passed through that I want to go back and touch on, changing gears like a lot, was you said you went and did a master's in data science. How did that turn out?
I think you know how that turned out, Ken.
But for the audience.
Yeah. So I started, so I guess in my timeline, so I started this master's when I entered that boutique data consultancy firm. And it was, oh, my noise canceling just died. So I actually went and started this master's of data science at the University of Technology, Sydney. And it was a 2-year degree or 2-year course of study. And it would basically go through from sort of like beginnings of data all the way through, anyway, the sort of standard masters in data science. And I did one subject and I dropped out. And so I didn't last that long. Well, actually, I did one subject and then I deferred a semester and then I deferred another semester and then I deferred another semester. So I basically deferred for 2 years while I was building this startup. And so I did
using university resources and deferring.
Yeah.
I like that.
So I basically just used the startup accelerator, but didn't actually do any university stuff. But so I did this first subject and it was basically like an intro to data science with R. And I asked, so I'm a big Python guy. Actually, I'm not even a big Python guy. I'm just the right tool for the right job. And like, while R might be a really great programming language at that time, what I was seeing is that all the innovation was happening in Python. Like everything, like TensorFlow, PyTorch, they're all supported in Python. R was lagging a little bit behind in terms of what's happening in current machine learning. And I asked the professor and the TA and said, hey, why aren't we doing stuff in Python or using libraries like scikit-learn or doing deep learning with TensorFlow or PyTorch? And they're like, oh, we're teaching you foundational concepts so that you can go out and leverage these in the real world. And I'm like, look, that's cool. I get it. So I did the course. I did pretty well in that course, right? Like I paid zero attention. I just like tried to smash through it and see what would happen. And so the fact that I did really well was probably like a self-fulfilling feedback loop, which was probably not good for the university because I was like, I paid virtually zero attention, smashed it. And I was like, I could probably just go learn this stuff myself. So the thing that caused me to defer was exactly that. I could probably go and learn faster, more efficiently than I could learn from university, than I could, and it be practical for my clients than I could from that course. The big thing for me is not the qualification, but actually being able to do this stuff in a practical scenario for the clients and for the people that I work with and for the people that I teach. So I thought that I would just, if I wasn't so concerned with the qualification and I was more concerned with learning and doing this practically, then there were better ways to do that for me at that point in time. So hence the recurring cycle of deferrals. But I've been very consistent since. Like I don't have a problem with discipline when it comes to coding and learning. When it comes to binge eating pizza and beer, different story. But learning, I've always been very, very good.
I really like that. And I think that that highlights something important about getting advanced degrees is, one, all the resources are available out there to learn all of these skills. I think I probably went to my master's program a little bit earlier than you did. I think I started in like 2015-ish.
Okay. Yeah, you would have. Yep.
And at the time, I didn't see as many tools related to data available to me. I think it was the next couple years where those really came into form. And looking back now, if I had a lot of the programs, coursework, Udemy, Udacity, 365 data science, these types of things available to me, that decision would have been very different, and I would have had to evaluate it. I went in, I don't know what the education system is like in Australia, but I went into quite a lot of debt to get my degrees. And that's not something I recommend for anyone to do without very, very careful consideration.
Mm.
And I also think that a lot of people don't realize, if you do one of these programs, especially if you're doing it part-time, like, no one says you have to finish. You can get a lot of benefits of some of these degrees by just going and taking a class. Look, you used the entrepreneurship program like for 2 years when you weren't taking classes. I know quite a few people that went to a master's program. After a couple months, they had it on their resume that they were learning it, and they got a job. And then, once they had that data science job or data analyst job, did they really need to finish that program? If they're learning on the job, if they're doing whatever, you could save a lot of money. You could, have a lot of opportunities without a program. I mean, in all practicality, if you have a data science title at a company, the master's degree qualification doesn't really matter, because you have proof of concept that you've been a data scientist before. I'm not telling everyone to go enroll in master's programs and drop out,
Yeah.
but that is looking at it a little bit different. That is thinking outside of the box. That is an opportunity that could present itself. And if you're on the fence and you don't want to pay all that money, you don't want to do those things, you do have all these other options. Like, just again, it seems weird that oh, I want to do this and I'm going to drop out and I'm a quitter or whatever it might be. It's like, no, you're pursuing the best opportunities. It's sort of a greedy algorithm at the time to set yourself up for success as much as possible. So I would behoove everyone listening to think of maybe a little bit less rigidly about education, about where you want to go, because there's no defined equation within this field. There's no clear path. And I really love that you've had quite a lot of success in this field. You're an educator in this field, you're an influencer in this field, and you made an educated decision, a risk assessment, to not pursue and finish this master's degree. And I think it was the right decision for you at this specific point in time.
Yeah, I think a key thing to note was that once I landed the job that I'm in now, I actually went and asked everyone. I said, hey guys, I've actually got my master's degree deferred at the moment. Do you want me to go finish it, or do you think it would add value for our clients if I went and finished it? And resoundingly, everybody's like, no, you got the job. You've got the skill sets, you can do the work. Like, why would you go spend your time doing that when you could just build stuff for us and work on actual projects? And I thought, okay, all right, so I guess you guys don't want it. Like, I actually went really, really high up in our organization. And so for anyone listening, I'm currently a data scientist at IBM. And so I went up and I asked my leaders, I'm like, hey guys, do you want me to go and finish this? Do you want me to go do it? And everyone was sort of like, I don't, Nick, do you think you are going to be a better coder or developer or a data scientist by doing this degree versus if you just went and used open source technologies, or just went and learned and did what you're currently doing? So at that time, I was building crazy stuff internally. I was just pumping out new prototypes for clients, and they're like, does that mean you're going to stop building prototypes? And I'm like, yeah, I'll probably have to spend a little less time. I'm like, no, keep building this stuff. So that basically just reaffirmed the fact that I don't think it would have made me any more successful than I was, or the success that I was gaining at the time. So it wouldn't have accelerated that curve at all. So made that decision.
I love that idea that you're gathering data on this. You're trying to understand the problem. And I think that that's something a lot of people just are not too lazy to do, but they overlook, right? If I was considering a master's degree, I'd reach out to 4 or 5 different companies that I was ecstatic about working for, or network, do whatever, and ask them what they thought. Right? If those are places I want to be, why don't I try and meet the exact specifications of the places and the opportunities that I want to create for myself? And to that point, I don't want to completely dump on master's degrees. I think that for specific groups of people, again, back when I did mine, it was 100% the right decision for me. I'm also
Mhm.
someone that I need skin in the game. I do very well in a formal, structured setting for education. I can learn on my own. I can do those things, but I have like pretty bad ADD. I get distracted very easily, and so having like the system of grades and I always framed a classroom setting as competition. And like I like to be one of the best students in the class, and that's been a powerful mechanism for getting me to learn. Like if the systems for formal education work well for you, and you have the money to spend, and there are these other considerations that are met, that's fine. Like it could be a good investment for you.
Mm.
But as it goes now, I think that for more people and a growing number of people, it probably doesn't make the most sense in this day and age. So that is one caveat that I wanted to make sure I have in, is that it really depends on your specific situation at a very high level. And we both come from different backgrounds, different time periods, and one, it made sense for me to go through with it. It definitely didn't make sense for you to go through it. And I think that that's like an obvious thing. Like people have different backgrounds, and they should consider those things when they make decisions. But a lot of the time, people will leave this one size fits all answer is out there, and it is simply not.
Yeah, and I think a key thing that you called out there is that people have different learning styles. Like I am the worst possible student that you could potentially have in a class. Like I will question everything if and the worst thing that can happen is that I don't agree with why something should be taught a certain way or why it should be like you've just completely lost me. Like I will just go off the rails and completely ignore everyone and like the last student you'd want to have in your class. But everybody learns a little bit differently. So in some students, some people will, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier as well, but certain people will learn using certain learning mechanisms. Others will learn using different learning mechanisms. So for myself, I love reading books and I love learning to code from books, which is probably so old school. People are going to be like, Nick, how you make video tutorials, but you like learning from books. And I'm like, look, I still use video tutorials, but I really like reading documentation and looking at the underlying code and reading process. Like I think I just learn and retain information a lot better that way. But again, the way you get to the end goal will be different for everyone, and that's perfectly fine.
Well, that's an incredible segue, because that's one of the last topics that I wanted to touch on anyway. And books in general, I've heard multiple people say, why would you learn code from a book? It's like, it doesn't make sense. There's these tutorials, there's whatever it is. And to sort of reinforce your point, I think it really does depend on your background, the specific medium. There are plenty of benefits of reading from a book, right? If I'm reading from a book, there are less distractions, right? I'm not, I mean, usually code along, but sometimes like before bed, I was reading through hands-on machine learning with scikit-learn and TensorFlow. Like I
Mm,
had that on my
yeah.
bedside table. I'll read a chapter and I learn about a different algorithm or reinforce that knowledge. And to me, that's perfect, because when I'm working on a computer, especially with the content stuff, it's like ping, 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 ping. Like I get distracted with YouTube comments. There's LinkedIn, there's Twitter, there's all these different things, and I
Yes.
silence them. I shut Windows, but there's always that, like, in the back of my mind, knowing that there's almost definitely going to be something that I should be responding to, and being able to turn that off is unbelievably powerful. I mean, the way I get most of the other information outside of data science is from books, and I
Mhm.
love it. One of my favorite things is I used to travel a lot more for work. I'd be on the plane, I didn't have access to internet, I didn't have any of these things, and I could read just like a full book, a plane ride, depending on how, well, yeah, almost like legitimately a full book, of plane ride now from Hawaii. But that was like one of my favorite times ever. It was super therapeutic. I felt like I jammed a lot of information into my head. And I, again, see this crazy benefit in that. But it really depends on if that works for you, and what resonates with the challenges that you specifically face in learning. For me, again, focus was a challenge for me, right? Like distractions were a challenge for me. And the better I could mitigate that using the resources, using my space, using the structure and timing, the more effective I was at learning. And again, that's something you have to be introspective about, and that's individual to your unique situation.
Yeah, completely agree. I think also funny that you mentioned about the long plane rides and using that time productively. So before COVID and lockdown, I was traveling every single week. There were times where I might catch 4 or 5 flights a week as we went down to client sites. But I used to do the same. So I used to go on to, we've got a subscription to O'Reilly Safari, and I would just go there. I'd download an ebook and I would go through it on the plane ride. Like I'd pull out my laptop, much to the horror of the person sitting next to me, but I'd start banging out code and just testing stuff. And like one of the cool things that I actually found about writing code on a plane with no internet is that it forces you to try to work out how to debug by yourself, because you can't just go to Stack Overflow. So I don't know if maybe there's some secret sauce in that somewhere, but I thought that was really that definitely was fun. And it's kind of cool that, I think you're right, there's so many distractions. So having the ability to just zone out and really focus on one piece of work, I call it deep work, is very satisfying. So one of the things that I actually noticed when lockdown happened, so we're in Sydney at the moment, we're in lockdown. What I actually tried to do is change my daily schedule, and I would try to do lots of little things. And so I would get up and I would make a coffee, I'd go and write some code, I'd then go and check emails, I'd then go and do a little bit of a course, I'd then go and work on some small project for like an hour, I'd then go and do another thing, go for a run. And I was doing lots of little things, and I noticed that it is the most unsatisfying way to work that there is out there, because you're like, I felt like I achieved nothing. I just did lots of small things that probably added up to nothing. Whereas if you take the time out and work on one, like do some deep work and actually work on one big block of work, is so satisfying. I don't know how I got to this part of this conversation right now, but deep work, great. Learning from books, cool as well.
Well, so that's one of my favorite books from Cal Newport. If anyone is interested in reading that, I'll try to remember to link that in the description. That's something that I've really struggled with, and I try to focus on as much as I can, is I try to do my most important big task early in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And with the podcast, with a lot of the stuff I'm doing, I have a lot of meetings now. And I'm currently trying to figure out how to adjust my meeting schedule to match the work schedule that I want. And I just took a trip for work and a little bit of vacation, and I booked no meetings. I like booked 2 weeks off, absolutely no meetings. And it was one of the best things I've done for my work. I admittedly, for the last like 3 or 4 months, I haven't loved coding that much. It's been a little bit frustrating. I couldn't get into flow. I was really struggling with the projects I was on. And on this trip, even though I was traveling all around, I didn't have an extra monitor, I didn't have these things, I was in the zone and I was loving it. I had so much fun doing model building for the first time in quite some time. And I think I really attribute that to the fact that my days weren't broken up by a meeting here, 30 minutes here, a check-in here. And I really am interested in, now that I'm back at home, how I can start adjusting that more to make more times like that. Whether it's, I usually book, it's hard here because my meetings are almost always in the morning, because that's the afternoon for everyone else in continental US, or mainland US. I think I'm still part of the continent technically, but those are things to think about. I mean, how do you structure your day? How do you make it most effective for time? That could be the missing piece of the puzzle. I think that's it for me, and I don't know what the solution is for that yet, but I'm definitely working on it.
Like a big thing, well, in life in general, right? Like you want to be happy. And so even though I'm working really hard, I love what I do. But over the last couple of days, I've just been thinking, man, I'm hating everything. I don't feel productive. And it's breaking up like the work into those tiny chunks, whilst great for your habits. So like I'm a big thing about atomic habits and producing that work. But I think I probably took it too far in that I'm just like, I'm not breaking it up into atomic habits. I'm breaking it up into atomic work, which is not satisfying at all. So having the habit to continue doing stuff repeatedly is great. But I completely agree with you. I think breaking up the work, like having that ability to just dedicate some time to just building something or doing something that you really want to do is a billion times more satisfying. So and I think once you're satisfied, you're happier, and it makes life a whole lot more enjoyable that way as well. But yeah, completely agree. The struggle is dealing with those meetings because yeah, I'm sort of like you. I've got client meetings just like they fling in every now and then, and like sometimes it'll just be a random call and it'll just completely throw your mindset out. Yeah, it'll be like, oh, now I have to go deal with this issue, or this client's got this thing that you need to go and resolve, and it's like,
you heard it here first, everyone, from Nick. The key to happiness is no meetings. So
yeah, oh, man. I'll bet my life on that one. Yeah, the key to happiness is definitely no meetings.
Awesome. Well, honestly, those are all the questions that I had for you. How can everyone find out more about you? How can they reach you? Those types of things.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks so much for those great questions as well, Ken. So I produce content bi-weekly or twice weekly on my YouTube channel, so Nicholas Renotte. I'm also getting a little bit more active on Twitter at Nicholas Renotte, and also same on LinkedIn. So those are probably the best channels to reach me.
Heck yes, I will link those all below. And again, I really enjoyed this. We covered a lot of ground, and honestly, just a really fun conversation. I'm glad I got to know you, and I'm looking forward to more collaboration in the future.